gradually curve and then go whoosh underneath. The first thing we'll do is draw a center line all the way around the carving. Some birds sit down and they always seem to have their tail feathers fanned out a bit, but I think with a crow, a really nice pose is actually a bit more compact looking. The tail starts to narrow and it doesn't fan back out, it just narrows all the way until the end at its most narrow point. Kind of like that. And then at the front, of course, the beak will come to a point, and then the head will actually have a little bit more shape here, but for now, just when we're roughing out, it's good enough to have kind of this elongated, almost egg-like shape. We don't need to draw in any details for the pumpkin, we won't worry about that until much later, but the very top where the pumpkin separates from the crow is important because that's one of the first separations that we will be carving. I'll start with knocking off the biggest corners, which will be up at the top. So you can really remove a lot of wood from the sides here because we'll end up carving in the tail quite a bit. And don't worry about those marker lines that we had from when we were sawing out the wood because we still have the pattern. We can always recreate that shape. So kind of rounding in towards the front and actually bringing that beak to almost a point. At this point we don't have to worry about getting that beak real exact. So we're just taking off the biggest hunks of wood right now. Take off the other corner on the other side, all the way down to the bottom at the top of the pumpkin. And now that we have the main corners up at the top carved off, we can move on to separating the pumpkin from the tail back here, and then after we separate the pumpkin from the tail, we can separate the pumpkin in the front from the belly of the crow. So I'm making all of these stop cuts, and you don't need to worry about completing them on the other side right away, because you can take off a lot of this wood in one slice. You could go back and forth, make one stop cut and meet that cut on the other side, make another one, meet that on the other side, but watch this. So now we have multiple stop cuts coming in from the tail, and now we can slice in and take off a bunch of those. Of course, we didn't get all of them there, but that's fine with one cut. So now we can already see the crow's body starting to separate from the pumpkin already. And before trying to work our way into here and around here, it'll be easier if we alleviate the wood in the front first, and then we can separate the very top of the pumpkin from the crow. A bit easier because, as you'll see, as we carve this corner in, this area, of course, becomes a lot more narrow. So now instead of having to slice across the whole top of the pumpkin all the way from here to here, we just have this little narrow spot right here. And we really don't have to be too careful with the crow's body. There's really a lot of wood to remove because the pumpkin will be wider than the crow, actually pretty much everywhere. The widest point of the pumpkin will be wider than the crow because otherwise we'll have a really chubby looking crow. Before we get too carried away with this side, we should start to replicate what we did over here on the other side And that's just to keep things a little more even and to keep the whole process a little more organized. So you can start to see that there is now two shapes, a crow and a pumpkin, not just one big old block of wood. It's about even on both sides now. And now we are left with this kind of big old chunky blocky pumpkin with all these big corners sticking out in every direction. And that looks like some low-hanging fruit that we can attack easily right now and take care of. So you can remove a corner like this. I'm doing multiple things in these steps here. I'm removing a corner and working up that cut towards the top of the pumpkin, and then I am slicing to the sides of the corner that we just carved off. And now I'm also removing the saw marks on the side of the pumpkin. Now I'm rounding the pumpkin, the side of the pumpkin, into this separation. So normally when I'm making this big separation between the crow and the pumpkin, I'm using kind of the whole edge of my knife. But when it gets down to this curve here, you might have to start using the tip of your knife, which I've done a couple times now without really explaining. But using the tip of your knife allows you to curve the cut as you go in ways that using the edge of your knife can't. This doesn't look very pumpkin-like down here, so we can take that whole chunk off. Now we can continue to work around the pumpkin and remove all these big corners and the saw marks. And we can remove any corners that we create in the middle of the pumpkin while rounding it. And of course, you don't have to worry too much about the shape of the pumpkin because pumpkins come in all shapes and sizes. It can be almost like a ball, like a sphere. It could be really squashed looking, wider than it is tall. But pumpkins typically don't have big corners sticking out. So that's all I'm really focusing on right now. Removing corners, making it round overall. While we're at it, we can look at the bottom a little bit, and you can see how it's kind of wonky shaped. That's okay, of course. It can be a bit oblong in certain directions, but I will just round it up just a little bit more, just to make it a little more of a circle on the bottom. Doesn't have to be perfect. Of course, if you grow a pumpkin in a box, it will be shaped like a box. But it's more convincing if your pumpkin isn't box shaped. It's a bit more round now. Now I'm kind of satisfied with where the pumpkin is at this point. Take off that cut here. So now I'm going to look back up at the crow because the crow still needs a lot more work. Pumpkin, the main shape of the pumpkin is essentially done at this point. We can always refine things and change things up later, but the crow is definitely a bit behind at this point. So the back is still flat. We still see all the saw marks on there, so we can start to work up from the bottom, from the from the end of the tail up into the back, round it off, take off saw marks, remove the corners. Looks like my knife is getting a little bit dull, so it's probably a good time to strop it a bit. Much better. Still just removing the corners, rounding it up. Working my way all the way up now to the head. And now we can look at these really rough marks, these really kind of crude saw marks that we left here on the belly. And of course, this is not the final shape we were going for. If you refer back to the pattern, we can see we want it to just be a kind of a tight curve under that beak. So you can kind of hold up the pattern and see just how much wood we have to remove here. So there's plenty of wood to remove, and even up at the top, you can see that the beak should come down as a gentle curve to the tip of the beak, and here we have kind of a bump sticking out. So first I'll address the curvature of the belly a little bit. So instead of just trying to shape it straight down, flat with the belly like this, we can alleviate some of that distance, some of that width we'd have to carve through by coming in at an angle, taking wood off the corners instead of going directly into there. And as you cut, you can work your way towards the middle. Now much easier, now much of a smaller width to cut through. We still have a lot of waste wood under here, so now we can see we have this crazy shape, kind of a very cartoony looking shape, just wild looking. And if that's what you're going for, you can actually leave this shape like that. You can leave the beak real big, but I'm going for something a little closer to what a natural crow would look like. I wouldn't say that we're going for a realistic look. We're not going to be putting that much detail into it, but definitely a simplified version of a realistic crow. So, rounding that curve. And now, this is still kind of a more gentle curve compared to how we actually want the area underneath the beak. We want the area under the beak. We want the bottom of the beak to be almost flat, and then so almost 90 degrees as it comes into the body, and then we want a bit of a curve underneath that. So that was not a super clear explanation. So if you take this straight line under the beak and you bring it in all the way here and then straight down, that's about 90 degrees. But we don't want to cut, we don't want to stop cut under there. We want a little bit of a curve to extend out from where it would be 90 degrees, if that makes any sense. And then we want, starting from right under the beak, we want this whole cut to slope downwards. We don't want it to come out as a big belly here. So that means that this can go a bit deeper here. And we will be having little talons sticking out, but there's still plenty of wood on top of the pumpkin here. Now the profile is somewhat appropriately shaped. We can shape the top just a little bit here if you want to. And now we see that, now this part is one of the major spots we still have a lot of wood to remove. So on a crow and any bird, when they're sitting like this, their wings are folded in on themselves and they stick out just a little bit from the head. So what I mean is we have to remove some wood on both sides of the head. So the beak will come in about like this, and then it'll curve out a bit just a little bit, and then we'll have where the wings are, something like that. And we can bring this in a bit more. Something like that. So now just taking it from the side, twist your wrist as you cut into the wood here, eventually going all the way to the tip of the beak, like that. And then you can do the same on the other side. Now we can remove the corner that we just created underneath the beak by rounding it off. And the same on the other side. And there's a bit of a corner created up here now. We can round that off. Round it off over here as well. Now I'm just removing the saw marks at the top of the head. And so now we can kind of examine and see if that's kind of symmetrical, and it looks fairly symmetrical, those cuts we just made. But now, in rounding this out and kind of defining the head from the wings a little bit more, we created more corners. So as you're carving this whole thing, as you're carving just about any character or creature, you'll be rounding certain areas, and every time you do that, you'll be creating corners in other areas to remove. So here we were, shaping up the head, but in doing that, we created these corners. So now we can just remove those. Now there's kind of a blunt end that we can see at the end of the beak here. To address that, we don't just want to round the beak up from the bottom of that blunt end because of the way a crow's beak is shaped. So the bottom, like I said, is almost flat, but it does curve up just a little bit. So overall, a crow's beak is from the side at least, is a bit of like a torpedo shape, I think you could say. Like the point of a torpedo. It does curve a little more on the top than it does on the bottom. But what that means is we can start just a little bit up from the bottom of this blunt end, slice down from there. Otherwise you'll have kind of a toucan looking bird if all the curvature is just at the top and you have this big beak sticking out and you have the beak curved downwards like this. It might look like a different kind of bird. Alright, and now we can curve the rest of it towards the top. Now it's blunt from this angle, so we can remove these little corners. Like so. Bring it in from the sides. Round it from the tip. Alright. It's still very thick here. But we can address that later. But just as kind of a sneak peek at what we're going to do, the beak won't just roll into the top of the head like this. We'll separate it with a bit of a curvature. The beak will curve up like this and then upwards just a little bit towards the head. Like so. But now, before we do that, I want to keep on going with this theme of keeping the whole piece at the same level of detail. There's still one big blocky area, and of course that is the tail. This tail is huge right now. It's very tall, and as we see in the pattern, we want the tail to stick out farther than the wings. And we could have sawed out a notch here, but it's such a small detail that sawing it doesn't really offer too many advantages. Doesn't save us much time. So we will draw in this notch where the ends of the wings are separated from the tail. Doesn't need to match up with the pattern exactly, but we don't want to go too far in with this. We do want the wings to be quite long, like this, but we don't want the wings to stick out as far as the tail. This will be another stop cut. And with this one I'll be a little more careful, because with this cut coming down from the top, if you press too hard, like a kind of a lot too hard, you could slice all the way through here, because the grain is going vertically. So if you stick your knife straight down into the grain, it's kind of like you're chopping wood with an axe. And of course, with an axe, you can cut through quite a thick piece of wood, and it's only that easy because the grain is going vertically and you're splitting those fibers. Right now, when we're cutting from the side, the grain's going vertically once again. When we're cutting in from this way, we're slicing through those wood fibers, but when we're cutting straight down, you could split those wood fibers. We don't want to split the wood fibers most of the time, unless we're really roughing out the general shape, like what we did on the sides of the tail when we were roughing it out. We split some wood fibers at that point, but that's not what we want to do here. That's the separation between the tail and the ends of the wings. So this cut is flat right now because we made it with that saw, and we want there to be a bit of a curvature here. So we can start from the bottoms of the wings, the ends of the wings, start slicing up, leaving about, I don't know, maybe around 1/4 of an inch or a couple millimeters over here of height for these wing tips. And now that we have the bird pretty symmetrical, we don't really have to worry about these center lines. It's okay to carve them off now as we carve off the saw marks around them.